Hey, what's up? It's Jesko here. Just quickly before I get into the video with Mark, if you want to follow along in the process that I took Mark through and that we're going to walk you through in this video, make sure you download my Home Studio Treatment Framework at the link in the description. It's basically my 5 steps that I go through to treat a home studio, and the same process that I took Mark through. So in there you'll find exactly what I think you should do if you're about to treat your home studio, if you're in the process of treating your home studio, and in which order to go through all those steps that make up the process of treating your room, right? So go check that out in the link in the description. And now let's get into the video. Hey everyone, this is Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And today I'm joined by my friend and former client, Mark. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to talk to you about your room and the process of getting to where you are now and what your experience has been like in the room. Just quickly, when did we finish? We finished last year, 2020, December or something, right? November, December, I believe.
I think that's about right.
Yeah, so you've been in there or you've been working in the room for like a half a year, basically, more or less, right?
Right. Yep. Perfect
Um,
timing with it hitting to have a nice room, a place where I could go and do my job.
right, right. Well done, well done.
Yeah.
um, so a couple of things that I want to talk to you about, but maybe just to start off with, do you want to just give people an idea of what kind of work you do in the room mainly? Like, what does your music world revolve around?
Sure. So mostly I'm a guitar player, and I'm in several bands. I'm in several worship bands, and then I have my own projects that I work on. And really, the room was kind of designed for me and my own projects. Now, we're in the control room right now, but I also have a jam room, a drum room, and an ISO room kind of on the other side of this wall here. And initially, when I built this studio 20 years ago now, I was going my day gig, and I was going to have bands in, and it was going to be this whole thing. And I started doing that, and then I realized what a pain it was, and how I wasn't really set up for it. When I
Right.
built my original studios, I can't remember the book I was using to design everything. And this was, so we're in a basement, and there were some walls, but I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I grabbed this book, and it turned out that that book guided me a little bit more on soundproofing than sound treatment. And so I have all these other rooms, but it turns out I'm not doing that much recording with a band. Mostly I'm
Mm.
recording my own things, and using drum programs, and I'll send it to my drummer. He comes in when it's time. So what I kind of determined is I'm not using those rooms so much, and that I just need to make sure that this control room is kind of set up better. So mostly right now I'm doing my own solo projects. I'm bringing people in when I need to, but it's not a full-time gig. Occasionally people will send me things and I'll mix on it. I joined Nail the Mix about 2 years
Nice.
ago,
Yeah.
and I realized that I was having trouble hearing some of the things that were in these mix labs, and that's when I started. First step was to, look at every monitor speaker that I could possibly look at, and think about, hey, could I pay my way to hearing these things better? But then I started seeing your videos and seeing other people's videos, and I recognized that the room was probably what was holding me back.
So yeah, on that front, good segue. Can you paint me a picture of what the state of the room was when you got in touch with me?
Yeah, so I had done some analysis a few years ago. I learned RU a little bit, and REW, and I did some analysis. And at that point, the only thing I really knew was Auralex. And so I called my Sweetwater guy. He said, hey, contact them. They'll do a room assessment. They'll tell you everything you need. And so that's what I did. And I had put up the foam that everyone loves, right, all over the room. But that was kind of where I was at, and it made some difference. It made some difference on kind
Hmm.
of the high end. The room definitely reverberated less when I was speaking, and some of the higher end, guitar stuff. But I was still missing some things, and I really, it was crazy because I couldn't hear compression very well. I couldn't hear low end. My mixes were not translating into my car, which is my de facto
Frustrating,
test. Yeah, if
to
I
put it
mix something that
lightly.
sounds great in here and then I take it to the car and it's not even close, everything was just muddy. And on top of that, as a guitar player, one of the things that was frustrating me is I'm always, like we're anal about tone, right? So
Sure.
I was always looking for this tone I had in my head and I could never dial it in. And then when I dialed what I thought was the tone I was looking for, it was translating horribly. And so again, I was thinking, okay, maybe the room isn't doing what I want it to do or what I think it's supposed to be doing.
Obviously, you then got in touch with me, and we kind of started working on your room. Do you want to just kind of give me a quick walkthrough of like how we progressed through treating your room? What did we actually do?
Well, yeah. So to take a step back, so once I knew there was a problem and that my Oralex solution wasn't handling the problem, I started reaching out to other experts in the industry, right? So I went to a few different people, and they gave me assessments of what the room needed. And this is a very small room. I mean, it's like 11 by 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
And pretty much everyone said it's gonna be $20,000-$30,000 to get the room to sound decent. And my wife was not very happy with those numbers. There's there's no way I'm hiding $20,000 to $30,000 in our budget somewhere. So so I just kept exploring, and then it was getting to a point where I'm like, well, maybe I can do some of this myself.
Right.
And then there was something I heard you say, saw in a post somewhere that was kind of a pragmatic approach, and it
Hmm.
was like, look, you can get 80% of the way there for very, very little money, and that 20% you could spend millions to try to sort that out. And I don't know if those were the right numbers, but it was like that. And I thought,
Sure.
that's what I need. I need pragmatic. I need
Yeah.
someone who's going to look at what I have and just is going to, solve some problems so that I can at
80%.
least, yeah, give me 80%. Man, at the
Yeah.
time I would have been happy with 60% and you
Right.
overshot. So thanks. But then I reached out to you, and there's a couple of things that I really liked right away is that you had a discrete process.
Mm.
Um, and for me, that was comforting to know that, okay, he knows how to plan this from beginning to end. Come to find out later, you were flying by the seat of your pants a little, I think.
Shh, don't tell
But
anyone.
but no, it was great. It was comforting. You kind of started off with, what studios are like, how they're built, what they cost to handle that last 20%, and what an 80% solution might look like. We looked at my room, and we came up with a plan of how often we were going to meet and what that was going to look like. And the other thing that I really liked about the process you were laying out was it was kind of on my timeline. So
Mm.
so music is my hobby, it's my passion, but it's my hobby. So my day gig is I'm a founder of a medical device company. I'm a computer scientist by training, and I split out of another company to start this medical company. And so I spend most of my time doing that, and it's busy. We just got an
Sure.
FDA approval, all kinds of stuff going on. So it was really nice to say, look, we're going to start, and there are the X amount of steps. And once you get to a point where you're comfortable with step one, then you schedule me and we'll do step two. And then when you're good with that, you go to the next one. Um, Being a bit of an overachiever, I think I went through the steps pretty quickly because I just wanted more and more and more. Being this lifelong learner kind of guy, it became fascinating for me really instantly to look at the science and the math behind some of these things. And then once we got to the build phase, I was kind of off to the races.
Yeah. So talking about the build, I mean, you did a really good job. One thing that was atypical for your room or in your room compared to a lot of other rooms that I work on is that we ended up basically turning the entire ceiling into a bass trap, and that was kind of the first thing that we did. Do you want to just like talk me through that a little bit? Like, what did we end up doing? What was that like?
Yeah, actually, that's maybe one of the most brilliant things about this room. And I noticed right away that it made a huge difference. And we can talk about that later if you want. But yeah, so I have a drop ceiling in here. And what we did is I made some frames instead of the ceiling tile. I guess they're 2-foot tiles. I forget all the measurements now. I've repressed all those building memories.
Yeah, yeah.
But
All that
anyway,
trauma,
we made,
repress that trauma.
we made these frames, and then I put fabric over it, and then there are 2 layers of mineral wool above the ceiling, and so the entire ceiling has got that in there,
Yeah,
and so it's just one massive bass trap, which is fantastic.
yeah.
I have a couple tiles still here that hold the lights in, but aside from that, it's one, you know, Yesko said, you don't want just a cloud, you want the whole ceiling. So you want the whole sky.
I
So,
want the
so that's
sky.
what I
Sky's the
built.
limit.
But it went great. In retrospect, there are a few things that I would have uh, changed a little.
Hmm.
The
Like what?
fabric that's on there is pretty thin, and
Hmm.
so I have the mineral wool. No matter what I did to put down as like lattice work, the
Yeah.
mineral wool kind of sags a little bit. So in some
Mm.
spots in the ceiling, it kind of sags down a little. So I probably needed to double layer the fabric around the whole frame, and then I
Right.
think it probably would have been okay. But um, the sound is is great, and that was what I noticed right away. So I did some measurements right after the ceiling was in, and I noticed that it was just that was solving some major problems.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Great. And then obviously building all the panels happened as well. Looking back at that, I mean, the entire process, really, the building process, how do you feel about it now? Would you do anything differently? Would you do it again?
Yeah, I absolutely would do it again. The first couple, like I made a prototype one just to see if
Hmm.
it was gonna what I wanted to do, and it wasn't so bad. And then you just kind of get into a flow. I
Yeah.
think you talk about that in your instructions. It's like if you can kind of line these things up and
And batch
um,
build them. Yeah.
batch build them, that worked the best. I did a couple things differently. I used pocket holes or pocket
Hmm.
screws,
Hmm.
and I like the way that came out a lot. They look really sharp. One of my recommendations to people is to splurge on a little bit higher quality fabric if you can.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
my ceiling tiles have cheaper fabric. The panels around the room have was it from the Maine,
Hmm. Guilford and
uh,
Maine. Guilford
Guilford
of
of
Maine.
Maine, yeah,
Yeah. Hmm.
somewhere in Maine
Yeah.
of and in, but yeah, that's what I ended up using in the panels, and that just worked great. Fewer wrinkles, it was easier to manipulate, and so that was good. I also I splurged and I had an air compressor, bought a staple gun for
Hmm.
it, and that made life so much easier in creating the panel. So I would say that if you can manage that, that was kind of nice. Near the end, I kept thinking, how many more panels do I have to
Yeah.
build? But um,
Because
yeah,
how
it
many
worked
is
out.
it in total? Like just excluding the ceiling, how many panels did you build?
I don't know. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 16,
16.
something like that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, and
So
considering like some people with bigger rooms, they end up building 30 of these, but then you had the ceiling to do.
yeah, and the reason that was a little bit time consuming is just because I was wrapping fabric around each
Yeah,
one of
yeah. Oh, these
these,
frames, yeah, these
frames.
little,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. When you were going into the whole thing, did you think it was even possible to get to where you are now? Or do you remember what kind of state of mind you went into the process when we first got started?
Yeah, I was super frustrated, to be honest with you, when we were first getting started because I
Okay.
was just disappointed in the room. I was looking at other rooms in my house that I could take
Right.
over, and my wife vetoed all of those. Even I was thinking about taking my drum room or my, jam room, which isn't super big. And there was always something that was kind of in the wrong place, a
Hmm.
door or glass or something that was going to make it less attractive. I have a water softener in the other room,
Okay.
next to it, and that goes off all the time. And so I was just frustrated. I wasn't happy with my tone. I wasn't happy that I was spending this money on these, on Nail the Mix, and I wasn't able to. I was just struggling hearing things, and then I started using headphones for a while. So I just kind of came into it like, just save me, Yesko. Just solve my problems for me. It's kind of what I was
Poor thing.
thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. So when the ceiling was in and I could immediately hear a difference, that was pretty cool.
Substantial. Yeah.
It was
Hmm.
substantial.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so at that point I thought, okay, it's certainly worth me building all these other panels and making
Yeah.
things work. Again, this room is so super not ideal. I mean,
Yeah,
I
so
have a
so let's talk
door.
about that. Yeah, so it's asymmetrical, right? So you got kind of we've got well, even the front, the now front isn't symmetrical because you've got that cubby on one side, that little corner,
Right.
and then that angled piece of wall on the back.
Correct. And where I would normally be hitting my primary reflection. So it's great on this side, but on this side is a door, like the
Yeah,
door to come into the room.
yeah,
So that was an issue. So the panels that cover that are actually on wheels and I can move that around. And that's worked out fine. I was concerned about that initially. But it just started to come together. And like I said, once I had that confidence that, okay, what we've done so far is working. And then I suspected that with adding these other panels, it was gonna improve even further. That's the other thing I really liked is when I saw that you had priorities on the spaces
mm-hmm,
to put the panels.
mm-hmm.
I started building this thing up organically. Like I'd build a couple panels and I'd put it in and I'd listen. And each time I went through, you numbered them 1 through 6 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
When I got one in place, after the ceiling, I started listening and I thought, okay, we're getting somewhere. And then
Something's
as I
happening.
progressively, yeah, I could just progressively hear that things were getting better.
Oh, that's amazing
Um,
to hear. Okay. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I will tell you, you nearly traumatized me to death though. Before we got to the build, I was going to mention that when I was doing the bass tests early on, when
Yes,
the room was completely empty. I
to
think I
find the
mentioned
listening
this to you.
position. Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that was stressful because I'm like, man, I'm going to be investing all this time in the room. I don't want to get this wrong. So I had my bass player come over and all these people listening. And the hard thing is in a room this small, there weren't that many places where it made a significant difference.
Right.
And so it was a little bit tricky. It ended up being, it could be the listening position facing this wall, or it could have been facing that wall. And
That's
it
right.
came
Yeah.
down to them sounding both pretty much the same. And so
Yeah.
it ended up being a comfort thing at the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
and then we go on to the stereo imaging part, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is going to be terrible too. And I'm going to be freaking out. But Mariah came to save the
Mariah
day for
saved
me.
us.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
she
Yeah.
saved us. So that part was straightforward and great. So I
So
guess
just
the comment,
for
the
everybody,
comments,
just quickly, let me just throw in for everybody
yeah,
watching this. Obviously, Mariah is Mariah Carey, and she's like our reference song, our reference artist that I recommend to set up your stereo your stereo triangle, to set up your speakers to go through the Phantom speaker test. And when everything comes together, it's just like it's divine.
oh,
Ah! Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
as far as the listening position on the bass side, the advice is not to stress over that too much.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of the things that I've learned since I came up with that technique and I started teaching that technique is that first of all, it obviously varies a lot with the types of rooms or like how clear the result is, right? Because what we're testing for is or what we're trying to listen for is how the bass changes because of a standing wave, a room mode effect. And some rooms just don't have that pronounced room modes. For example,
Mhm.
because the walls are very flimsy and a lot of bass escapes. So the low energy escapes through the drywall, and these resonant room modes never properly build up. And that was probably what was happening in your room because half or like the kind of the corner that we see behind you, I think is brick or concrete, right? And but then the walls basically that you're looking at, the ones that we can't see, definitely to your left are drywall, right?
Correct.
And so what happens in that case is that obviously you don't get this very clear standing wave pattern, and then the bass doesn't change all that much when you go through the bass hunter technique to find your listening to the position, right?
Mhm.
And it can get pretty confusing. And if you're expecting this very clear result, and then you're not getting any of that, then that can be very confusing and disconcerting. But on the other hand, there's also this component of that it actually teaches you something about the low end in your room, and it
Mhm.
challenges you as a sound engineer to figure out or to for the first time often be conscious of what good bass actually sounds like.
Right.
Because I mean, how do you know, right? You're listening to some music and the bass changes as you move through the room. Which part of that, which combination of that is the right amount of bass? Yeah,
Right.
and that's something that is can be tricky to figure out, right? So I mean, there are I always say, test the extremes first to figure out what is wrong on one side and wrong on the other end of the spectrum, and then kind of try and see what happens in between. But it's a process that challenges you both technically and on a taste and skill level. So it can be a fairly challenging process to go through. But most people I know who do it and who take the time to do it properly do get proper results. Like, it does work, and it always ends up being a good, or it's always a good place to start there, to then start or follow up with the rest of the process.
Right.
Next real question for you, I guess, is, or that I really want to hear about, is what has happened in these past 6 months since we finished? What have you worked on? What kind of things have you learned about the room? Has anything surprised you? Has anything surprised you that it didn't work out quite as you expected, or is still harder than you expect? Can you just like run me through that? What has the past 6 months been like?
Yeah, so the first thing I noticed, and it was almost instant, is I thought, okay, I'm going to dial in some guitar tones and see
Mm-hmm.
if I struggle with that and see how that translates. And I think I sent you a message right away, like, oh my gosh, my guitar tone has never been better, right? So
Yeah.
I, for 99% of the work I do, I use an Axe FX. So I have an
Right.
Axe FX 3 mounted in in the desk that I built, because I figured I'm building all these panels, I might as well build a new desk, right? So so I did that, but yeah, right away dialing in patches was so more fun, and it
Mm,
really rekindled. It was inspiring to write because I was
I
starting to
love that. Yeah.
hear what I wanted to hear out of my guitar. And so
Yeah.
that was the absolute first thing. Then from there, I started doing, just mixing more stuff, not
Mm-hmm.
my stuff, but also on Nail the Mix. And instantly I was able to clean up the muddiness on the bottom end. And that
Mm-hmm.
was where I was getting the most frustrated, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest with you, is number one, guitar tone, because that's what, you know, people want me for, is my guitar mostly. And
Right.
the mixing thing has been more of a, I just want to get better at it and, mix my own records and that kind of thing. But once we went from guitar to getting to the point where I could hear my mixes better, I could really hear the instruments being separated and then kind of glued together at the end. It was just awesome. So I'm still not the best mixer in the world, but I can hear now, and I can tell what needs to get worked on, and so I'm really really excited about that.
Yeah,
So
it
at
is.
this
It is a
point,
process, right? I mean, learning the room both, but I mean, just mixing, as I tend to say, it's a skill that you need to learn. Mixed translation is a skill, right? The room
absolutely
isn't going to mix that song for you. You still got to do it yourself. It's just going to help you hopefully make the right decisions, right? And
right.
speed up the process. And what I really liked that you said was that it's fun. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a creative process here, right? This is supposed to be fun. I mean, my favorite moments are when I'm mixing a record and I really like the song and I just get into the flow state, and like I get into a flow state, and it's
Right.
just those potentially just a few hours, maybe just an hour of that state of mind where you're just intuitively making decisions, having fun, grooving with the music, feeling what you're trying to do rather than consciously making decisions. I think that's what it's all about, right?
Right, absolutely. And I'll tell you, one of the the weird side effects of this is I used to write. I get in this mode where all I was doing is writing, and I didn't really care how things sounded too much, and it was all
Hmm.
about just kind of composing the song and that kind of thing. And now, unfortunately, I'm kind of mixing as I'm writing, and
Yeah.
because it's so much fun that I'm like, I'm going to compress this, or I'm going to EQ this now, and it slows down the creative process on one side, but it's speeding up the process on the other. So it's kind of a funny side effect.
That's exactly what I like to hear. Yeah, I mean, it's on one hand, it's being more aware of smaller details as well, and distinguishing between things that you weren't able to perceive before.
Hmm.
But then as you're learning that obviously influences the other side, where you're now working way more intuitively and hopefully quicker, and just experimenting quicker, making decisions quicker, right? You're not second guessing it all the time, or not second guessing it for that long. You would like make a decision, try it, and you very quickly realize, does this work or does it not work? And move on to the next thing, right? So
Right.
that's
Yeah,
that's
the other
Go ahead.
interesting side effect is I'm still mixing on these old speakers that I've had for 15 years, and it turns out they don't sound as bad as I thought they sounded when my
Right.
room was terrible, right? So saved thousands of dollars there.
Yeah.
um, so
I think
that's
it's
just been
it's always worth trying to get as much out of the room as you can manage, as you can justify, as you can finance, I guess, and
mhm.
just seeing how far you can take it with just the speakers.
And that, actually, it's interesting. I did for my day job. I went into a studio, like a legit huge studio in town here, and he had some I forget, they were focal speakers, but they were
Hmm.
like uber high end. And his room is insanely treated. And I was listening, and I'm like, man, it sounds good in there. I mean, it sounded good, but I wasn't like $6,000 blown away by the
Hmm.
sound of those speakers. And I thought, man, and here I was getting ready to, invest in, and I don't know. I think things sound, they sound good enough in here right now for me. It's
Yeah,
again, it's a pragmatic thing. I'm not, I think it's to the point where I can learn the room enough to do everything that I need to do.
sure. That's
And,
great. Yeah.
and if my wife asks me, I will deny because I need more gear. But um,
Can never
I
have enough gear.
I think it's actually at a pretty good point right now. I feel comfortable in here. Now it's more about me and the art than I
Yeah.
think the room, which is exactly where
Excellent.
I wanted to be.
Excellent. So two questions I bet people have on their mind. One, how long did it take you, the whole thing? But two, I mean, we said we finished in November, December to 2020, but so that, and two, how much did the whole thing cost you, including my fee, obviously? How much did you
Yeah.
invest in getting the studio to where it is now?
Yeah. Okay. So first thing, I don't remember how many phases in the steps in the program, so to speak. So
5.
five. Okay, so five. So the first three I think we did in subsequent weeks. It was like
Right.
right away. And then is four the build one? I think.
Yes, yes, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. So I started off like gangbusters on the build because I just wanted to get it done. And then at a certain point there was, I forget what happened, but I had to take a couple weeks off of building panels. But I went pretty quick on this stuff. I think I finished the whole thing in like 3 months and somewhere around there, 3, 4 months. And that
Hmm.
included 100% gutting this room. I
Yeah.
had to scrape off all the foam that was on the
Because it was
walls, and
glued onto the walls,
it
wasn't
was
it? You,
glued on.
yeah.
And so I had to patch all that, repaint everything. I put in new flooring. So just, laminate wood flooring, yeah, paint, all that stuff. And then I started, the base hunter and then the ceiling. I mean, all that stuff, it was just, but I was getting after it every day after work because I just really wanted to get to the point where I was reaping the benefits of this thing.
Sure.
So yeah, I feel like it was 3, 4 months maybe
Hmm.
to get the whole thing done. As for cost, um, I was keeping track of that for a while, and then and then I stopped. So I'd have to give you a range. It was probably somewhere between 3 and 5K total,
Hmm.
um, and that's literally everything.
Yeah.
So including like the floor, the wood for the floor, and paint and fabric and wood panels and
And all of
you
it.
and
Yeah.
yep. So to me that was perfect, well spent. Like I said, I was going to spend more on new monitor speakers, and I think
Yeah. I mean,
that I
considering,
got
right? I mean, for 5K, that means 2.5 a pop, and that's easily reached.
yep,
That's like, yes, it is an expensive speaker, but it's like there are way more expensive speakers than that, you know?
correct.
And I mean, there
Yeah,
are hardware units, 19-inch units, get some like fancy compressor and you'll pay 5K, you know? It's
right,
possible.
right.
Yeah. And this
Yeah.
is, I mean, sure, we can't underestimate the effort involved, but as a bang for your buck kind of calculation, as how much you're getting back and how much it's influencing everything that you do.
hmm Yeah, for sure. And you know, obviously you could go when you do your own rooms, there's a range. You can get the less expensive wood or the less expensive, fabric or less expensive screws, or you don't have to use pocket screws or, whatever. You don't have to build a desk. And in fact, I built the speaker stands too. They're so easy and they were so inexpensive with just MDF and, a little bit of paint. And I have, pretty decent speaker stands at this point. So
Yeah.
um, there's ways to cut it too. But at a certain point, I was like, I wanted everything to be consistent. So I think I got everything at Lowe's. And so I'm like, okay, at one point I went to our Home Depot to get some of the slat wood and it was all bent. And I thought, that's one thing that really isn't going to work too well is, I don't want a whole bunch of curved slats on my walls. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but yeah, so I feel like it was well worth it. And honestly, I started to have like withdrawals when we stopped meeting because I
Really?
enjoyed our meeting. I did.
Ah,
I was like,
I'm
man,
so sorry.
I enjoyed, you have such a wealth of knowledge in this area. And again, as another,
No, I appreciate that.
science geek listening to you explain this stuff, and it makes total sense. It sometimes took a little bit of time for it to totally sink in, but in between, sessions, it was, things were to make more and more sense. So
Mm,
that was pretty cool.
awesome. Now, with the experience that you've got with the room, is anything has anything been surprising to you, or is there anything very different than you expected originally, or than you thought you expected? I don't know. In hindsight, I guess. What stuck out to you the most in this entire process?
Um, I think the biggest thing is there's always this kind of trade-off between comfort and sound and those kinds of things, right? So you're always kind of like, because of my listening position and where things are at, like I have to, when I'm getting into mix mode, I got to move these panels over. But that was such a small little trade-off to get things to to the point that they're at. I think, that's kind of the the big surprise, if you will, is that, ideally you just walk into a room and it's just perfect every time. But as I have, gone through iterations with you and looked at what was possible, I think you just kind of come to grips with the fact that there's always going to be some kind of concession.
Yeah.
And very quickly I worked through those. It's like, okay, I move this over to here. When I want to mix and want to really hear things, I kind of move it over and it's not that big of a deal. Um, Really, the biggest thing for me is just how good it sounds now, how good it was possible to make this, because I was really in a bad place, man. I was
Mm.
like, this sucks. And I'm not going to spend 30 grand on this, and so I'm just really impressed that it looks good and it sounds good. It feels
It
good
looks
in here.
amazing. I mean, it looks
Thanks, man.
fucking A.
Thank you. And my wife helped with colors and stuff like that, which was cool. That was stressful too. I mean, there are some stressful things,
Yeah.
when you're
Yeah, yeah,
investing
yeah.
money.
It's
It's like,
surprising how stressful picking a color can be.
and a fabric and, but yeah, I'm just blown away. And everyone that comes in, they're like, man, it just sounds great in here. And again, I'm working on my speakers from 15 or more years ago, $800 a piece, I think they were back in the day. And, they're just 6-inch speakers and that's about it. So, yeah, I'm kind of floored with how much was done in a little amount of time and a little,
Yeah.
relatively little amount of money.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is just like taking the plunge, being or trusting enough that doing this first big chunk of work will give you results. I think a lot of people get stuck overthinking a lot of stuff when it's all about just like focus on the fundamentals and just do them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And and you'll get results. It's not perfect, but it's good enough, as you mentioned before. And so in talking about that and kind of looking at some more like a bit more detailed components of the sound that we kind of built together. So maybe just starting with the diffuser fronts. Obviously we can see them behind you. Have they appeared in any way in your, like, have they consciously made an appearance in the sound with what you're hearing, or have they just blended into the background? Like what's your kind of verdict on the diffuser fronts at this point?
You know what? I don't know. I don't really, like, I don't know enough to know the difference about, what the diffuser, if the diffuser fronts are doing anything separate. So
Yeah, yeah,
um,
fair enough. Hmm.
I wish I were better, and I could say that that's, I think they look awesome. And I'll tell
They
you, when
do.
I have meetings, when I have meetings, people are always like, man, I love the art that you have on the wall. I'm like, that's not art. Um, so,
It's art, form meets function.
there you go.
Um, uh, I mean, the point of them is really to reduce or mitigate any chance of like over damping the room, right? Or rather, just sucking up so much high end that the room feels claustrophobic. Yeah, it's a slightly difficult conversation to have because there are more components to it than just the reverb time in the high end. But
Right.
so I guess the only question to ask at this point is, does the room feel overdamped? Does it, or what's the ambience of the room like when you're in it?
It's just nice. It's just comfortable, I guess is the way
Mm.
I would say it. So I have, like I said, I have a couple ISO booths in the other room, and one of them was just covered in foam, and that was kind of the room that I'd throw an amp if I wanted to,
Yeah,
mic an amp. And when I went to that room, it was always uncomfortable. It was like
yeah,
not quite an anechoic chamber, but
yeah,
kind of felt like that. It just felt really weird. Like I didn't want to spend much time in there, as
yeah,
bizarre as that sounds. In here, it's just great. I mean, I work in here. I have conversations in here all the time. It's it's not harsh,
yeah,
and it's not. It doesn't feel like all the life is sucked out of it. If all the life
yeah,
was sucked out of it, it was because, again, to be honest, I use my X effects in here, crank up the monitors. This is where I practice. This is where I write. When my bass player comes in, he sits in here. We jam in here together.
right.
If it sounded like it was it just wouldn't be inviting. It wouldn't be inspirational. And it's kind of the perfect balance for me in here right now.
The thing is, like, all this, you saying this with a reverb time that I think is below zero point 0.2 seconds or like above that, somewhere around that range, yeah, which is very, very, very short for the most of the spectrum. So
Mhm.
just for people to kind of take away, there's a difference between dry and dead. Yeah, I always say don't mix those two up. Dry just means very short reverb times, and you need the room to be dry in order to reduce the impact of the room on what the speakers are doing. Yeah,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that the room has to feel dead, because deadness is or yeah, deadness, I guess, is also a function of early reflections of the space that of the space that's or the feeling of the space that you get when you're in it, right? So as much as anything, these diffuser fronts are there to give you a sense of the space, and that's what makes it feel relaxed. It's kind of natural. It feels like a living room, right? It feels like a comfortable
Mhm.
living room. That's at least what my space feels like. Um, but at the same time, it's super dry, and that's kind of what you're aiming for, or that's what we're aiming for at least. So let's
Yeah.
move. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you said something a minute ago that I think is important for people to understand, is that if you focus on the fundamentals, the room is going to sound good. The placement, your listening placement is huge. Getting the triangle right, getting, your desk in the right place, doing the, the panels in the right places is another thing. And I know that you and I had this conversation. Like, I was getting hung up on things like, well, do I buy this pad to go underneath my speakers, or do I buy this one? And you're like, dude, come on, man. That's not making it.
I'm sure I didn't say it like that.
No, you were like, man, what are you on crack? That is not, no. But the reality is I kept focusing on the wrong things. And once I started focusing on the right things, and we started hitting the the foundational concepts,
Yeah,
things started to really come together. And sure, there's like cherries on top that you could keep adding and you could iterate. Again, that was one of the things that I really liked, is when we started this process, it was going to be an iterative thing, and you mapped it out, and I could build those things or invest in those things as I had money, as I had time. And I think that is great. And there's, likely additional things I could do to this room to kind of fine tune it. But at this point, things are working pretty well.
excellent. So with that said, let's actually move to the one thing that I guess is the most obvious that is still kind of lacking, or that didn't work out as well as we would like. There is still a fairly significant dip in the low end, and I'm showing you this, people watching, to just show you what the reality of treating rooms looks like. Yeah, this sort of stuff happens mainly because oftentimes we have to make compromises just because the space doesn't allow for it. Yeah, it's not big enough. There's a door in an awkward place. For whatever reason, we might not be able to do everything that it takes to get to perfect. Yeah, and I mean, just listening to Mark talk up to this point, clearly it's still working out. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect and that you need it to be perfect, and it's okay that some things don't work out quite as well. Yeah, in this case, the way that I plan treatment is that I try and hit all the basic acoustic effects that we would expect to happen, including what I expect this dip what is caused by, which is most likely a speaker boundary interference related effect. But obviously you need to then also do that part of the plan in order to kind of in order to get rid of this particular the particular cause that causes this dip. And maybe in Mark's room, I can't remember, I don't know exactly which part we left out because it wasn't possible, but there are several compromises we made as we went through the planning stages of your room, just because of the shape of where the doors are, where that cubby is, where that corner is, where the window is, several discussions. So there's always a compromise involved. And in this case, it just so happens that there is this one big dip that remains. That said, how has that impacted your work? Has it at all? What has your experience been like mixing low end, listening to low end, working with low end?
Yeah, this is one of those times where I think we mix too much with our eyes, or think too much with our eyes. Like once I
Mm-hmm.
saw REW, I'm like, oh man, I'm never going to be able to hear this. I'm never going to be able to figure out what's going on. What the heck, right? That was actually, you asked a question earlier about, what was a big surprise. And that was one of the first things. I'm like, what the hell? I spend
Yeah.
all this with this guy and I still got this huge, I'm just kidding. But
Well, I'm sure
honestly,
I'm sure that did happen to some extent.
yeah, I don't know, maybe. But it honestly, it hasn't, so much of the spectrum sounds so much better now that it hasn't impacted me a ton. I know that that's a frequency that I might have to address, and that may be one that when I go into the car or something, I may not hear the way I expect. But um, I- from what I've seen, it hasn't been a huge issue for me. I've just been
Mm-hmm.
able to kind of learn around it. It's really nice when you know that there's just one part that you have to, maybe question or give a little bit more attention than the whole freaking spectrum. So
I mean, the obvious idea at this point, looking at that, is what about room correction software? And I'm sure we definitely did talk about it. I can't remember exactly if you did get SonarWorks or some other piece, and if you were actually using it. Can you
yeah,
just walk me through that?
yeah. So even before we were meeting together, I was using SonarWorks, and I think that was helping some, but it certainly wasn't able to, correct the whole room problem. Now, I certainly feel like it's again, it's just getting me a couple better than I pretty much leave it on for everything always.
Mm-hmm.
Initially I was kind of turning it on and off, and I major difference, and I thought, okay, this is doing what I want it to do. What's interesting is if you look at the old profiles that I was using before we did the room correction, and I look at the ones now, it is way less aggressive in the things that it's having to fix, which makes sense, right?
Yeah. And that's what we're hoping to do, right? I mean, it's these kind of equalizing speakers is a tool that we have at our disposal. It is worth using, but it comes with compromises, as does everything else. And
Sure.
we want to minimize how much we need it. But sometimes, especially, and I think your room is a good example to some extent as well, even with a significant amount of treatment and effort put into it, we're still not even remotely flat when it comes to the frequency response. Yeah?
Right. Hmm.
And at that point, you're kind of out of options. Like we've done all this work to correct and improve the time response, but the frequency response is a tough bugger. And in some rooms, when the what I like to call the source material in acoustics, the empty room, the size, the shape of the room isn't beneficial, is suboptimal, is another word, then you will have that imprint on the frequency response from start to finish. It will just permeate through the entire process. And at that point, you have the option of basically investing, doubling your investment into acoustics, or you
Right.
just say, okay, screw it, I'm just going to use EQ. I'm going to be careful with it. I'm going to be diligent with it, but it is a tool that is available. And especially for these kind of scenarios, it is very, very beneficial.
Yeah. One of the other companies that I talked to before I met you, they basically said, I need 24 inches away from every wall. Basically, it was going to be uh, the room was going to be so small because it was going to be 24 inches around the whole thing for panels, wall to ceiling, the whole thing. And this is where at some point I need a space to work. I need to be able to
Yeah,
hold my guitar and play, right? If the room is so tiny, and even that, I'm not sure if that would solve the problem we have. This is really a small room, and at the point when you have, where I have my speakers now, there's just not a lot of room for the bass. So
yeah,
it is what it is, but it's comfortable. It sounds good enough, and that's really what I was shooting for. I wasn't shooting for, sunset sound or anything like that. I was
yeah,
like,
yeah,
I need good enough. I need to be able to. I need to be able to learn how to mix better. I need to be able to write and create. At the end of the day, I'm not too proud to send my stuff off to have it mixed by a professional if I have to. That's totally fine. But I wanted to grow, and I wanted a place where I could grow, and that was it. And so it could. I mean, it'd be nice if this room was just like a normal rectangular bedroom or something, but it is what it is. So.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Mark. I think it's a good a point as any to wrap up. But there's two questions I still wanted to ask you. One
Sure.
is, and I mean, you've given high praise already, so thank you for that.
Mhm.
But what do you like most of the room about the room, and what do you dislike the most about the room?
Um, I like how honestly how cozy it is in here. I mean, with the
Hmm.
light and with it feels comfortable down here. I like that a lot. I think if I were gonna point to something that I dislike, it's just the minor inconvenience of having to move this panel when I need to. And I'm actually already addressing that because I
Oh
have
yeah.
another door over here that
Yeah,
is
yeah,
to
yeah.
kind of storage, and that goes to a hallway. I'm going to put another door in there so I can mount this for, more permanently. But I think that's really it. If I were to dislike another thing, it's like I wish it were a little bit bigger.
Yeah,
I'd love to have a couch in here so that when
yeah.
I have the band in here, like right now, it's comfortable to have two people in here. You add that
Hmm.
third person in here, and it's like it
Starting to
gets
get
less
cramped.
comfortable. Yeah, it
Hmm.
starts to get a little cramped. Um, but that it's just you best you can with what you have, and I
Yeah,
think that's about it. I mean, again, I'm really pretty excited that we were able to take this tiny room and make it sound as good as it is. So that
mm.
excite every time I come down here. I mean, it's cool. And I'll tell you the other thing. Could I have bought panels? I probably could have over time bought panels and put them in from, one of the big companies. But there is something cool in looking at the walls and everything that I actually did that, and my wife helped with this part or that part, or my daughter helped with this part or that part. And
It's a
there's
very
there's a
personal
little bit of,
space.
yeah, there's a little bit of pride in the fact that I remember how hot it was when I was sanding all of these things down and, all that kind of stuff. So I think there is a cool pride thing that you get from doing this stuff yourself. Um, so yeah,
Awesome. Mark, I think it's a good point to leave it at that. Thanks for so much for sharing all this with us. And thanks for joining me in the process way back when. I remember that it was a really fun time for me as well. And so I guess the only thing to say at this point is I hope you enjoy the next years to come in that space as much as possible, and it keeps bringing you joy.
Right on. Thanks, man. I appreciate all you did, and thanks for the sessions.
Sweet, man. Speak soon.
All right. So